My guest today is Duducu. I'm sorry about for the last name. He is the writer of the Sultans. I'm holding it up in the right here. The rise and fall of the Ottoman rulers and their world. And as always, they ask, how did you come about writing about the Ottomans?
Absolutely, yes. So let's start in some sort of slightly weird places. So first of all, the reason why I wrote this book is because I guess I am part Ottoman. My father is Turkish. We'll explain what that means a little bit in a moment, but it means that I grew up with stories from him about the Ottoman Empire. And then I grew up and I got a degree in archaeology and medieval history. And I realized that some of the things he was telling me was not necessarily agreed upon in actual history. And so you could say that the Sultan's book I've written is almost like a very gentle rebuttal to all my father's stories as I was
In your
growing up.
face to your father, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
you're not. I wouldn't quite say in your face, but thanks, Erlend. But yeah, I actually credit him right at the beginning. It's sort of dedicated to him. The most magnificent Ottoman since Suleiman is what I say there.
Mm.
But I think perhaps a good place to start, because I know you want to go through the actual Ottoman sultans, is actually to start with what is a Turk. So I mentioned that my father was a Turk. And so you have the Republic of Turkey, which most people know about, but the Republic of Turkey was founded in 1922. If you looked on a map in 1300 or in 500 BC, there was no place called Turkey. It's a sort of an artificial creation after World War I, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So literally, it's had its 100th birthday this year. So it means that today you have a new country that needs to talk about its past. So they tend to pretend that everybody was Turkish in the Ottoman Empire, and they absolutely weren't. Like in the Roman Empire, not everybody was Italian. You've got different cultures, different nationalities, different religions, different languages even being spoken. But it was also a common mistake during the Ottoman Empire. You would frequently get accounts in, let's say, the Renaissance era of Italy being attacked by Turkish pirates. It's like, no, they were pretty much guaranteed not to have been Turkish. They could have been almost any other nationality, Greek, Serbian, Albanian, whatever, Syrian. But, you know, they were all under one particular flag, one particular authority at that time. So the reality is that if you're trying to look for Turks, they do exist in the world today. There is a place called Turkmenistan, but the Turks, things like the Seljuk Turks from the Crusader era, these Turks existed, but they came from the Far East, from the Central Asian steppes. When they came over at the end of the Roman Empire, they were called the Huns. When they came over in the 1200s, they were called the Mongols. But the Mongols, Huns, Magyars, the Turks were all the sort of Central Asian people, these steppe nomads, very good with horses. And that is not what a person in the modern Republic of Turkey looks like. You know, they look kind of Greek or kind of Italian because of all the interbreeding in the Mediterranean. So actually, no, Turkey is not the place full of Turks today, and it wasn't full of Turks 500 years ago either. Much to my father's disgrace, I must say. He was very upset when we did the DNA results, and it proved that we were basically part Bulgarian and part Arab. You know, that mixture makes complete sense from the context of the Ottoman Empire, but he seemed to think that he was almost like a direct descendant of Osman himself.
So something that I wanted to bring up, and we talked about this before the recording as well, but you said that they rely a lot of Ottoman history for Turkey, and you can see this in media today. There's a show about Abdülhamid II. There's a show about Osman's early youth called Ertuğrul, about his father. I screwed up that name, but and I don't do that a lot in this episode. I feel like, but there's a lot of media around Ottoman history, and in the episode about Alan Mikhail as well, when we talked about Selim the Grim, we talked about how Erdogan, he named a bridge after Selim the Grim. So they do really rely a lot on Ottoman history for Turkish history.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some people that call Erdogan like the new sultan. You know,
There is even a
he
book
is.
titled that name, I
Yeah,
think.
exactly. Yeah, and that's clearly what he's going for. But weirdly, I think that, you know, in Norway, if some, I mean, well, question for you: if somebody sort of said that they were the new Eric the Red or
Mm.
Sven Forkbeard or something like that, would that go down well with Norwegians, or would that be seen of we're past
I'm
that?
not too familiar with him, to be honest, but I would think people would look weird at it. Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't think people would. Who the fuck is that guy? I mean, there was in 2011 there was a terrorist attack in on Utøya, which was horrible. It was massacre of young politicians,
Yes, yes.
if you
So sorry to
remember.
hear about that. Yeah, yeah.
And the guy's favorite hero was Sigurd Jorsalfar, who traveled to the First Crusade. That was the guy's favorite hero, Anders Behring Breivik's favorite hero. So you can see there are some people trying to resemble something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sadly, there are lots of people around the world who take the wrong lessons from history.
Exactly, yeah. And so if you Google Sigurd Jorsalfar, who was, and I have definitely plan to make an episode on him later because he was, we're kind of a little derailing right now, but I want
Nothing wrong with that.
yeah, exactly. But like I want to say because he was set the precedent for kings traveling. He was the first king traveling to the Crusades. That another kings like Barbarossa and Richard III, for example, to mention a few, they would follow his example because he set the precedent. No,
Yeah,
for kings following to the crusade to Jerusalem to do a holy war.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So obviously, some of that holy war is sort of put in my book because the question is there is the story of, we keep mentioning Osman, we've mentioned it offhand, and we've obviously mentioned it before the recording as well. Who is Osman? Why do we keep mentioning him? Because he
Because
is the
yeah,
the first person to. He is the dad, the father of all of these other rulers that will go on to be Ottoman sultans. Now, to be technical, the first few rulers weren't actually sultans; they were ghazis or emirs, and they had other titles. But give it a few generations, and it's big enough that they can start calling themselves sultans of an empire. But what's unique about the Ottoman Empire compared to, let's say, the Roman Empire is the Roman Empire was ruled by many different families. The Ottoman Empire was ruled not quite father, son, father, son. There's a few uncles in there as well. But you could absolutely draw a straight line from Osman in the 1300s all the way through to the 1920s. It's, you have this unbroken chain of the same family. Osman can also be translated into Arabic as Ottoman, which is where we literally get the name Ottoman Empire. It's named after Osman, the founder, and that is absolutely accurate because,
not a
again, if you
guy
can.
named Otto, conveniently.
Yeah, yes, yeah. I mean, I guess we should, because everyone calls him Osman. We should call it the Osmanli Empire, but that's never going to catch on.
I mean, you gotta respect that though, that they had one dynasty throughout the entire reign of their empire. That, like we talked about the Romans, and that Julio-Claudian dynasty only lasted
Yes.
Nero, and then we get a year with 5 emperors, and that's a continued thing in the Roman Empire, like you said. But you gotta respect them for that they do have one line of dynasty all the way until the 1923 when they fell apart. That's really impressive. But
Yes. Now, I guess this might be an opportunity to talk, because I know we're going to sort of come on to it again. But how were they able to do it? All these other empires, like some of it's political. Nero wasn't a very good ruler, but you also get some of these sort of kings or emperors where they just don't have any male heirs and things like that. And the reality is they
that was
had
something the Ottomans weren't lacking, to be fair.
no. They had harems, and so this is an area to talk about slavery. So slavery is going to pop up multiple times. The Ottoman Empire is, shall we say, well known for its slavery, but it is worth pointing out that slavery was just around the world in all cultures and religions and civilizations up until basically the 1800s. That's the time when we work out that owning other human beings is not a good idea, which obviously we can all agree is not a good idea. Slavery is bad. I'm saying that, but there are different types of slaves. And in the modern world,
though, I'm just gonna go on a limb here and say aren't
sure.
Contracts and with an agent contracts with something kind of like owning someone like you.
Oh well,
I'm just
you can
saying
argue that in court.
technically.
So the thing is, they had harems, and who were the girls in the harems? And the answer were, according to Islamic law, Muslims cannot be slaves. So what did they do? They got Christian girls to be in these harems, and they were converted to Islam. Now you could then technically say, well, they're now Muslims, they can't be slaves, but the Ottomans would have said, shut up. This is they were originally
I
Christian.
mean, this was a thing in the not just Ottoman invention. This was in the Umayyad, or as far as from back from the Umayyad Caliphate.
Oh, absolutely,
Every
yes.
caliphate basically had this.
Yeah, and same for all the various sort of like Islamic powers in the Iberian Peninsula and sort of Spain and Portugal as well. Yes, this was absolutely standard practice. But here's the thing: it's like, you are a 16-year-old Serbian girl. You have two choices. You can be a free woman. The year is, let's say, 1500. You can be a free woman. You're definitely not a slave. But what are your actual life opportunities like in 1500? You'll probably marry a Serbian farmer. You'll probably, have 8 children. You'll never leave any further than the little village that you live in. You might end up dying of starvation or childbirth or rampaging armies coming through your area. It's not going to be a great life, but you are free. Or you
You
get
can
picked up.
become the wife of the Sultan, the slave of Sultan, and perhaps even give birth to a future Sultan.
Exactly. Yes. Now, obviously, this stuff becomes a bigger deal later on in the Ottoman Empire, as you know, because you read the book. But
Yeah.
look at it this way. Okay, if you turn up in the harem, yeah, you are now probably going to have to sleep with somebody that you've only met once before, but you get 3 meals a day. You get taught how to read and write poetry and musical instruments, and you have guards to protect you from the outside world. It's not the worst gig in the world, to be honest. Now, again, it's
Considering the era that is, considering the time that
yeah,
they
the
lived in.
other options that women had in 1500s or 1300s wasn't great for anybody, really.
And we're
So
going to come back to him later, but and again I brought this up earlier, but in with our episode about Alan Mikhail again, we're talking about Selim the First mother, who actually I believe the
yes,
Urban, so I don't remember her name. But she was actually quite intelligent. She built several sick hospitals for where she governed with Salim the First. And you
yeah. So
see
this is
that a lot of these
Roxolana.
are intelligent women who do a lot
Yeah,
of good things when they come into the harem and then they get educated and they get an opportunity they never had before.
but bringing this sort of together with the Turkishness thing, so you've got Osman, who definitely is a Turk, and he turns up with 300 horsemen. And he takes over this tiny little town called Soot in modern day Western Anatolia. It's really the middle of nowhere. Even today, it's nothing. But the point is, he may have been Turkish, but if his son is like, let's say we have no idea what the ethnicity of these girls were, other than the fact that they were Christian. But if every single sultan's mum is not Turkish, that means, there are records of some sultans having to dye their
Yeah.
blonde beards brown or dark, or black. It's so Erlend, chances are you're about as Turkish in inverted commas as Abdulhamid II or someone like that.
Right, yeah.
They've actually got the DNA is so mixed up. But of course, in the sort of patriarchal society they lived in, if daddy is a Turk, that means you are a Turk, and that's the way it goes all the way down.
Yeah, so let's begin with how does it go for Osman with his 300 archers? Because and he does what we talked about earlier off record. He does quite well actually. Goes to the weakest areas like we talked about earlier. And so is that was that
Yes,
the
so there is this sort of myth, if you like, the image of the Ottoman Empire. If people have even heard of it, it's like, oh, they're the Muslims trying to take over Europe.
hmm,
While it is technically true, that's not what was going on. By 1300, the weakest power in the east of Europe and into the Middle East was easily the Byzantine Empire. It was a shadow of its former self. It had already collapsed once under the Fourth Crusade, but had managed to recover a bit. And so what Osman was doing was picking a fight with the weakest opponent, which makes complete sense when you've only got 300 men.
And
And
basically,
so,
what Ottomans would later be known as the sick man of Europe, that was Byzantium at the time, right? They
yeah,
were the sick man of Europe,
yeah,
basically.
it took the Ottomans another 500 years, but they took over the place of the Byzantine Empire of just being a completely spent force. But we're obviously at the other end of it right now. And so, yeah, Osman, we know almost nothing about him. He minted some coins. That's it. That's the only physical evidence of him. But because his son, Orhan, built on Daddy's initial successes, and because you then get Murad and the others building and building and building, Osman goes from being a completely obscure little warlord in the dead end part of an unfashionable bit of Anatolia, and he suddenly becomes this person of more importance because of what's happened later on. Now, the other thing I know you want to talk about is the story about him and the tree sprouting from his navel. So there is this wonderful story that Osman falls asleep one night. And he's lying there, and as I said, a tree literally grows out of his belly button, his navel, and it shades him from the sun, and it's this mighty tree. And he's very confused by this.
God damn it! I just want to get some tan.
Yeah. Well, for starters, you're ruining my tan here. But he then goes to like a local mystic, and the mystic explains that he's just dreamed that he's going to be the founder of this great empire. This sounds great. However, the earliest recorded example of this story coming out is 100 years after he died. So this is a great example of an empire beginning to grow, beginning to feel more confident, needing to sort of show that the beginnings of this wasn't by accident, that it was almost divine, that it was, inshallah, God wills it, sort of thing. And it's one of these things like King Arthur in England, and there are other kind of nation building myths and legends. George Washington never telling a lie, and all this kind of stuff. And it's all harmless, but it does tell you something about the society that invented it.
And
they
again,
didn't
we
think
talked about this before, that it's kind of like the Romulus and Remus of the origin of Rome kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so, the Romans needed to, no country wants to say, hey, we happened by accident. So instead it's like, it was divine providence. Yeah, Romulus and Remus, it was all, they are suckled by the wolves, which is obviously that's impossible. But, it's a good story, and everybody kind of believed it in the Roman Empire, and everybody kind of believed the story about Osman in the Ottoman Empire. But yeah, they had other things to do day by day.
And I forgot to say it in the beginning, but this will be a two-parter because it's kind of a huge topic, the Ottoman Sultans, we want to go through as narrowly as possible here. But it's something real. And again, it's kind of spoiler alert, but it's there's quite a few. There's just two Osmans, and we discussed this as well. That there's just two Osmans in the entire reign, which is kind of surprising. We got 14 Louis and 11.
Oh, there's more Louis actually.
Yeah,
and France even had 10 Charleses.
Yeah, 16 Louis. Sorry, I mean, so 16 Louis and 4, 5, 6 Arthurs in the Henrys. Sorry, not 4 or 5 Henrys in England, and we just got two Osmans in the Ottoman Empire. That's quite fascinating, actually, to me.
And as you said, you go up a few numbers on things like Murads and Mehmets, but not many. You never get to 10, and it's the same family. Now, look, I know you sort of like asked, it's like, so why is that? The simple answer is nobody knows for sure. But I think my theory is that because it's the same family, there's never a need to sort of say, I'm legitimate. Whereas when you get people like Henry VII of England, he had to fight a civil war, and he had a terrible claim to the throne. He was the guy who should have lost the battle. He had the weaker claim to the throne, but he got lucky. He won. Richard III died in the battle. Henry VII gets to become king, but Henry goes back centuries, and Henry V was a great warrior. And so Henry's a great name. Also, another one in England is Edward. Edward was the go-to name for 1,000 years, but because the most recent Edward VIII, sort of decided to stop being king, we'll never have another Edward. And so I think I think the best theory is because they're all from the same family, they didn't feel the need to sort of keep replicating other people's names. But we don't know for sure.
Hmm. It's just kind of interesting how they don't choose to do this to me, and I think it's something I don't think a lot of people, like I said, it's what names is fascinating in itself in dynasties. Like I think, but anyway, let's move on to the second sultan. As we talked about, there is not much literary writing about Osman the First. I'm sorry,
No,
but the second one there is quite a bit more. We know way bit more about him than we did about Osman,
yes, yes.
don't we?
So we now move on to Orhan, who is the son of Osman, and he is unusually, because later on we're going to see they did love killing each other, the brothers, but he worked incredibly effectively with his brother Aladdin. Now, as soon as you say Aladdin, and I'm going to tell you he's the Grand Vizier, this fills people's minds with exotic tales of things like Aladdin or whatever. You put all that out of your mind. Grand Vizier simply is, in modern terms, prime minister. So you got Orhan, who is the military leader. He's the guy coming up with the vision, but Aladdin is making it all work. He's putting it all together, and he's beginning to grow a sort of a central authority, a system that will turn into the Ottoman system. And these two brothers worked incredibly effectively together. So
I
much
do think you
so,
write about this as well in your book that he kind of accepted. He wasn't really too interested in being the ruler. He wanted to be an administrator, more like he didn't
yeah,
wasn't too interested in ruling the empire. Not as maybe not empire yet, but let's call it that for simplicity. That he wasn't really interested in ruling the empire, was he?
yeah, absolutely. He was clearly a talented administrator, and administrators aren't necessarily talented generals. And whereas later on, if you are the sultan, you don't want anybody challenging you, and you already have an administration up and running, and that's why you can start killing off brothers. But let's not go there yet. But these two worked really well together, and actually they get their first big win for the Ottomans. They capture the city of Bursa, which was an important city for the Byzantine Empire. So now they've just lost one of their most important cities.
But something that
It
we
did.
forgot to say is that it took quite a while to take
Yes,
Bursa
it
in.
did. Yes, this was not quick. This is not like the siege of 1453 of Constantinople. They still had their horse archers, and therefore the best they could do was surround the city and try and starve it out. So it took about 9 years of siege to get that to work, and then even at the end, there wasn't a big epic battle. Instead, they basically paid off the local Byzantine administrators to just let them in. There was no massacre. There was no epic last stand. But it worked, and they get their first big win, and Bursa becomes important. It becomes the second capital of the Ottoman Empire, and it's the first proper capital. This is where they start burying dead sultans. Osman is not buried in Soet. He's buried in Bursa, as are all of the Ottoman sultans leading up to the siege of Constantinople. It becomes kind of even when they move on from Bursa to another city in modern day Greece called Edirne. Well, actually, it's still technically just inside the European bit of Turkey. But yeah, so Edirne is the next capital after Bursa, but Bursa is kind of the capital city for a few generations.
Erlend is
It's
Adrianople previously called, right?
yeah,
Before they
yeah, yeah,
changed, yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's right.
So where did they go on from after capturing Bursa? Because obviously they want to expand the empire. And how do they plan on
And they do,
expanding?
yes, absolutely. But of course, this captures the attention of the Byzantine emperors, and we get one of them called Andronicus III, and he raises an army. Now, it's not, if we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire of the Byzantine Empire in the year 500, they would have been able to produce 20,000 elite troops, and it would have been awesome. Instead, Andronicus, much diminished in his power, he managed to pull together a few thousand troops. Most of them are mercenaries. He can't even get his own guys to fight for him. He meets Orhan in battle, but what happens though is that the guys actually they know each other's tricks. So in case of Andronicus, he knows that the horse archers are going to sort of drive forwards, and they're going to fire their arrows, and then they're going to sort of like do a fake retreat. He doesn't fall for it, and
And
so both
again,
sides.
like we talked about before recording, this was kind of a Mongol tactic, right? This
Yes.
was one of the Mongols' favorite early tactics during Genghis Khan's era, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, so when the horse archers and their feigned retreats, you could say that's classic Mongol, that's classic Attila the Hun, and it's also classic Turks in this situation, the Ottomans. So this is all working quite well for them. But Andronicus and other generals from the Byzantine Empire have seen this tactic so many times they don't fall for it, and so neither side really gets an advantage until towards the end of the day. Andronicus gets minor wound, presumably from an arrow, and but the thing is though, the soldiers start talking, and so a minor wound turns into a wound, turns into a mortal wound, turns into the emperor's dead. And so they all break up and they all start running away. And so Andronicus made no mistakes until right at the end when through gossip, basically, his army disintegrates. And at that moment, when they break formation, perfect time to send in the horse archers, and it turns into a massive defeat for Andronicus. He manages to get back to Constantinople. He gets back alive.
Turns
But
out
that's
he's not dead.
he's definitely not dead, it turns out. But that's the last time the Byzantines have the capability of sending an army into Anatolia to try and stop the Ottomans. It's not obvious at the time. Everybody assumes they'll be back again, but actually, through historical perspective, we know they never get their act together to do that ever again. So with Orhan, it's a time of expansion and consolidation as he's beginning to put his own unique stamp on this area. It's not quite yet an Ottoman Empire, but it's going in that direction.
So when did they become an empire? When can we officially call them an empire?
I think it's probably it's probably Sultan number 3. Once we get there, then it's just reached that critical mass of it's now big enough. Now, I know one of the other things you want to talk about, and this is where we can absolutely start talking about them, is the Janissaries.
Yes.
So this is where we again have to talk about slavery, and again have to say not everybody was Turkish. So what's happening again? If you're the girls, you might end up in the harem. What they're looking for is healthy young boys. But again, they've got to be Christian because they're going to be enslaved as the Janissaries. But the Janissaries, if there's one thing people know about the Ottoman Empire, it's the Janissaries are their sort of elite troops. And this is true, but they're not Turks. They're Christians. So they're probably things like, they're definitely not Muslims. They could be Jews as well. So they could be, again, sort of Albanians, Greeks, Serbians, Bosnians, etc. There are lots of different nationalities. And so these young boys are brought into the Janissaries. They are converted to Islam, and they then have to serve in the army. But the good news is that if you do a good job, you're going to go up the ranks. It's a I'll say that in English, a meritocratic organization. If you do well, you will get promoted. You compare that to what's going on in Europe, where the people who run the armies are the people who own the land. And you can be the best knight in the world. You're never going to go up because you're born to the wrong family, basically. So it's a really efficient system, and you will get to retire. And if you do get to retire, and this happens for centuries, you probably are going to end up being an administrator for an area.
There's something that I want to bring up though, before you go on, is that this isn't an entirely new Ottoman invention. It has happened before, and you have the Mamluks as an example of this. So why does the Janissaries succeed there? Why don't they go in revolt like the Mamluks did with the Abbasid Empire and then form their own empire? So why does the Janissaries succeed, whereas the Mamluks were a complete disaster?
Well,
Not necessarily disaster, but for the Abbasids, disaster for the Abbasids, more or less.
Look, you raise a really interesting point. Again, this goes back to the slavery conversation of if it was so awful for them and they're the military, it should have taken them 3 months to get trained and then just turn on their masters and then take it over, basically like the Mamluks did in Egypt. But this system lasts for centuries, for about 450 years, because they can basically see that they're going to get rewarded. And again, I think, this is an opinion, I think they just, like everybody else, because the Ottoman family is so ingrained to the empire, it doesn't even occur to people that we need to get rid of them. And, there are rebellions and revolutions and there's quite often sort of like if there's political grumbling, it's usually coming through the Janissaries. But the first thing an Ottoman Sultan will do is when he becomes Sultan is he will pay off the Janissaries. He'll give them
The kind of like the
gold and goodies.
Praetorian Guards of the
Exactly. Very
Ottomans.
similar to the Praetorian Guard of ancient Rome. And this works fine for like 300 years while the empire is growing. But when the empire starts shrinking, then they don't have as much money to go around, and eventually the Janissaries get disbanded because they're more trouble than they're worth. But they're disbanded; they don't sort of revolt and fight to the last man. So again, this is an example where yes, these people are technically slaves, but the reality is they're probably doing better in their lives than they would have been if they'd just been left to work on their farms. And indeed, perhaps the most famous Janissary of all time is the best known architect in the Ottoman history is a guy called Sinan, and he was a Janissary. So we don't know exactly where he was from, except we can tell you that he must have been Christian, and he definitely wasn't a Turk, and yet he's building epic mosques like the Suleymaniye and is considered one of the greatest Islamic architects of all time. A guy who's technically a slave.
So something that I want to bring up as well is that I don't know if this was from early on with the creation of invasion of the Janissaries, but the families were as well taken care of if a Janissary fell, right?
Absolutely,
so it was kind of wasn't as bad as it sounds like to be a Janissary in a sense.
In the cold conversation of historians, you're absolutely right. But the asking for these young boys, it has a technical name which I'm not going to bother going into, but it was literally called the blood tax by some people, and indeed you will get today Greek scholars, because the memory of the Janissaries. I mean, there's nobody alive today who's ever been a Janissary, but the sort of like the social awareness of our Greek boys were taken away by these evil Turks and forced to fight in the Janissaries, that they still will call it in schools like a blood tax. But you're quite right. It is more complicated than that. It was a pretty good job, actually. And there are many examples of families hiding their boys, but just as many examples of families going, take him. I got too many boys. He's strong. Take him, and we're going to get looked after by the state after that. So it's the Ottoman Empire. If all it did was just take and take and take, it would have fallen in the first 100 years. But it was obviously building society as well.
Something that the Muslim families later on as well, they tried to sell their boys again into Janissaries as well, didn't they? That's later
yeah,
on. Course,
later on. Yeah, I mean that shows you how popular it was. No, I'm not that Muslim. Go on, take little Mehemed. Yeah, off you go. It's a bit like in the Christian era of the gladiatorial games. Christians would, who obviously weren't slaves, they weren't pagan slaves, actually were happy to sort of like try their luck as gladiators. There are these dangerous opportunities that for young poor men that have nothing else to do, why not? I guess you're more likely to win than the lottery, but it is more dangerous than the lottery as well.
So let's move on. So how successful did the Janissaries early on did it become successful quickly, or does it take time to become this elite force of the Ottoman Empire?
It takes a generation to become an elite force. But the other critical thing is we've been talking horse archers. These are infantry. They are elite infantry. They start off with bows and arrows, but as soon as firearms become a standard thing, they've got firearms, and they are considered by Western armies really good shots. The other thing is that they are a bit like horse archers are lightweight cavalry versus the heavy knights of Europe. It's the same thing with the infantry. The Janissaries generally don't wear a lot of armor. They'll have a small shield. They'll maybe have a steel helmet, but most of their clothing is silk. And they are known for their huge plumed helmets and their military bands, the first military bands in history, men marching in time to sort of like music, is from the Janissaries and not from something in the West.
I just want to add, sorry for interrupting you again, but
sure.
We forgot to mention that this would be the first standing army since the Roman Empire fell in
Europe. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, this is, it's not exactly revolutionary, but it's an innovation not seen for 500 years or longer, really. So it is, and it's a sign that the Ottoman Empire is now a formidable state-run operation. You know, this isn't now just 300 horsemen making it up as they go along. They now have, you know, the administration to make it work. They've got the communications network to make the sort of like tithes operate as well. It's very sophisticated now, and we're probably getting to the point where the Ottoman territories are probably better run than most parts of Europe.
So let's talk about the next Sultan, because we have to kind of move on. This is a, like I
Oh
said,
yeah,
this is
yeah,
a
we got one to get
two-parter.
through.
And we have a lot of sultans. We got 600 years of history here. So let's talk
Yeah, we
about
do.
Murad the First, and as you said, it would capture Erdin. So is this when we start to see that is he the one that started to kill his brothers, that he doesn't want competition?
Yes, so we now start to get the I feel threatened, so therefore I'm going to start killing my brothers situation. This was to go on for centuries, and the best way to look at it is Game of Thrones, because if you it happened. It didn't really start formalizing until perhaps a bit after Murad, but we get the civil war, which I think we're going to have to come on to pretty quickly. But anyway, yes, but we now got Adrianople, Erdene, which is now, you know, that was a major city in mainland Europe. So we've now got the Ottomans heading across the Dardanelles and the Hellespont, and we're now into what we would consider Europe proper. But they needed assistance. You know, the Venetians and Genoans were trading with both the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire. They're happy to make money anywhere.
Their policy was kind of like trade first and religion after, right?
Absolutely. Let's face it, isn't that the best way to do trade? Yeah. So it was, you know, it wasn't some great Ottoman armada that got them across the shores, but Christian Italian vessels that was doing this stuff. So yeah, you're seeing that the Ottomans are having, you know, they are evolving, they are improving. You know, they started off with a horseman, now they got the Janissaries. You know, they've now got a decent sized capital. Now we've just won another major city. They've already taken other important cities like Nicaea, which is nowadays Izmir. You know, there are lots of other, you know, they are growing and expanding. But I don't want to just talk, you know, just very briefly. We keep saying Byzantine because that's the one that we all know, but they're also fighting these local Muslim Turkic warlords as well. They are not just going for the Christians, they're going for anybody who's sort of on the edges of their expanding territory. So it doesn't matter who you are. If you're kind of weak enough, or, you know, we think we got a chance with you, they'll go for you. They are expanding eastwards into central Anatolia as well. But basically, it's a lot of desert there. So you're going to be more interested in the city-states around the modern-day area of Greece, heading towards Constantinople, but not quite there yet. So with Murad, this is what you've got going on there. And then you've got the, you know, sort of fast forwarding a little bit, we start pushing into the Balkans. And then in the late 1300s, we've got the Battle of Kosovo. Now, this is incredibly important to anybody who's listening to this that's Serbian. They know all about the Battle of Kosovo. In fact, you might have even heard of the area of Kosovo, which is to this day Muslim. The Battle of Kosovo is almost sacred if you're Serbian. So this is where the Serbs fight the Ottomans. We're now at the late 1300s, and it is an absolute bloodbath. It is very rare for medieval chronicles to talk about heavy losses on both sides, and it's almost impossible to find another battle where both leaders of both sides are killed during the battle. But and so because of this, at the end of the day, both the Serbs leave the battlefield and the Ottomans leave the battlefield. And it's there, you know, so the Serbs talk about how they held back the tide of Muslim invasion, and technically it's true. But the reality is the new Serbian king is a baby, and the new Ottoman Sultan is Bayezid Yildirim, better known as Bayezid Thunderbolt, and he is a great warrior. And so the Ottomans can simply take this bloodbath more in their stride. They have more men, they have more resources. the Ottomans rebuilt, the Serbs couldn't. So the Battle of Kosovo is the big breakthrough of getting the Ottomans into Europe, scaring the rest of Europe about, oh my God, there's this new Muslim power and it just seems to be unstoppable. And so it's
That kind of carried a new Battle of Tours kind of thing, right?
Exactly. Yes, really. Yeah, that's a really good example. It's sort of like, oh, the Muslims are pushing into, and they're right. But and Bayezid is this amazingly energetic. When you sort of think about a kind of Genghis Khan, that type of person, he's that sort of leader. Bayezid Yildirim means literally Bayezid Thunderbolt because he was very good at attacking fast. However, what saves Europe or Eastern Europe from further Ottoman incursions actually comes from a completely unexpected area, the Far East, where you have this rise of this other Turkic empire led by a guy called Emir Timur, who has been forever remembered in English as Tamerlane, because Timur was lame. He was literally paralyzed down one side of his body. He came from a really poor background. Don't have time to go into him, but basically he's a really interesting guy. I say a lot more about him in the book, but he was a huge and powerful warlord who had captured pretty much the whole of Russia and Georgia and sort of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all of Central Asia. And now he is smashing into Anatolia. Bayezid hears of this and he raises the largest army the Ottoman Empire at that time has ever pulled together, and they meet at the Battle of Ankara.
So but doesn't Tamerlane win this battle though?
He wins. Ankara is now the capital city of modern day Republic of Republic of Turkey, but at this time it is a tiny little village. It's nothing. But Bayezid, basically, if he was up against anybody else with that sized army, he would have won. But he was up against a guy who was just as aggressive as him, just as much as a warlord as him, but he had even more of everything else. He had war elephants. And for the record, horses will not charge elephants. They're kind of scared of them. And that's a problem when you got
medieval era, the medieval/ancient era of versions of tanks, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. They're draped in armor. They got two guys on their back firing arrows. Also, he'd picked up sort of kind of flamethrowers from a different civilization. And Bayezid had none of this. And so Bayezid, who absolutely was a formidable warrior in and of himself.
I want one of those.
Yeah. Let's get some flamethrowers, shall we? He is the only Ottoman ruler to ever get captured in battle. Tamerlane puts him in, basically takes him back east. And Bayezid, he doesn't die because he's ill-treated. He just dies of disease. Let's not forget, this is a time when there's lots of disease going on. But this is a critical point for the Ottoman Empire because you've now got all of Bayezid's sons and there's no clear ruler.
I'm just going to stop you right there for a moment because something that fascinates me, and I wanted to bring this up when it came to Tamerlane, because why doesn't it charge further into and just shatter the Ottoman Empire? Why doesn't it go in? He had a switch through, he captured Bayezid. Why doesn't he go in further into the Ottoman Empire and expand his own empire that way?
Well, because I can definitely answer that. So there's two reasons. So first of all, the Ottoman Empire from that point after the battle becomes a vassal state. He doesn't need to conquer it. They have to pay all the taxes now to Tamerlane. But the other thing is this is happening at the end of Tamerlane's life. He dies a couple of years later from stomach cancer. He was actually about to start campaigning in China. So that's the other thing. It's sort of like, quite frankly, the Ottoman Empire is nowhere near as big and rich and powerful as China. And I think there's no doubt that if Tamerlane had lived another 5 years, he probably would have taken at least most of China. Everyone gets very excited about Alexander the Great for winning 8 years in a row, and that's impressive. Tamerlane conquered pretty much the same area as him, only he ruled for 30 years and he was also disabled. You know, he was paralyzed down one side of his body. Tamerlane's an amazing story, but we don't have time to go into it here. Yeah. But this shatters the Ottoman Empire. We now have years, about a decade, just over, of these various brothers fighting against each other. And in the meantime, the Byzantine Empire realizes, oh, we're onto something good here. They bought us some time, so we're just gonna cause chaos here. And then we're gonna also have And also the Tamerlane's family, they throw in another brother who they'd had on standby as well. So the Ottoman Empire is kind of is basically this is the point where it could have been destroyed and just becomes a footnote in history. But we've then got both Mehmet and Murad II, and these are seen as basically the second founding of the Ottoman Empire. They managed to pull together everything again, and that's an amazing achievement for these two
So
rulers.
in a sense, I kind of want to compare it to Alexius Comnenus here, because he's kind of doing the same, right? With his kind of rebirth in the Byzantine during his time before the First Crusade is kind of in shatters, right? And it's Alexius come back. While he's not necessarily a great general himself, he does manage to bring back the empire together. So what were they kind of like an Alexius of the Ottomans, that it kind of, like you said, they bring back a revival of the Ottoman Empire again?
I think it's a good comparison for people who aren't familiar with Ottoman history. But what you also have to add to this is these guys genuinely had to fight in the field as well. So we're at the point where increasingly in Europe, if you're a king of a country, you're spending less and less time actually fighting battles. It still happens. This is still the time of, let's see, in Britain, we're sort of round about the time of Henry V, the famous general fought in the 100 Years' War. But, there are other kings who didn't fight battles at this time. Whereas you go back 100 years earlier and every single king of England at some point will have been fought a battle somewhere, and it was same pretty much around Europe. But these are the Ottoman Empire, there's no getting around it, was a very martial empire. They absolutely needed to prove themselves, particularly the first half of the Ottoman Empire. If you couldn't fight in battles, there was kind of question marks over whether you were a particularly good ruler. Even if you were balancing the books and bringing in the trade revenues, you also needed to bring in some military success as well.
Right. And how does they manage to balance this thing when they bring back the empire to, I wouldn't say for glory necessarily, but how do they bring stability?
I think former glory. I think former glory is fair enough. And so you get So if we sort of like move on to sort of like Murad II now, he becomes sultan as a teenager. And this happens a few times in a row of like these teenagers, and they are remarkably mature.
To be fair, the teenage ruler, it wasn't uncommon in that era either. Like you had teenage kings but teenage kings in Europe, it wasn't uncommon to put it that way.
It wasn't unique, but again, if I'm going to use English history as a kind of example. You get people talking about Richard II and Henry VI, and it's sort of like, they were boys when they became kings. It's like very true, but they did live till they were sort of like into their 30s or 40s, so they had time to get better, and they never did. And whereas you got people like literally sort of 16 years old having to decide, do we deal with the invasions from the east or do we deal with the invasions from the west? I mean, that's a hard decision for a 50-year-old to come to a conclusion with. Yeah. And these guys got it right. So they were really, really smart. Perhaps one of the best examples is Murad II. He actually managed to get an army to besiege Constantinople. Constantinople was so important to the Islamic world because if people aren't aware of it, most people know that the holy book of Muslims is the Quran, and that is true. But there's also like additional information called the hadiths, basically the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. We can start debating whether they're canon or not, whether they should be, for further information, there's been 1,000-year-long argument over how valid are they. And sort of the work successes of Islam actually but in it, there's a story, cutting a long story. Basically, one of the Prophet Muhammad's followers says to him, "You are the greatest general ever," and he says, "No, I'm not. It is the man who conquers Constantinople." At that point, every Muslim ruler now wants to capture Constantinople, and Constantinople has withstood more than 20 sieges. It's got double walls. It is an amazingly effective defense network, surrounded by on two sides by water as well. just if the Prophet Muhammad picked an excellent target because if you can break into that, you will be remembered as a great military leader.
And
So
something that we have to mention as
go
well,
on.
and is that Murad the first, second, sir, is not the first sultan either to try to of the
No,
Ottomans to try to conquer
no,
Constantinople.
you're absolutely right. I mean, yeah, like I say, other Muslims have tried it. He's not even the first Ottoman to try it. But Bayezid did actually try it as well. But Murad II is the first one to try it with cannons. But just to get technical for a moment, and those at that point they would mix the gunpowder on site, which actually tended to mean it was less effective, and that meant his cannonballs hit the walls, but weren't hitting them with much force. So he's actually laid a siege. This is incredibly expensive and it's incredibly prestigious. And then he finds out that there's an attack from the east from Turkic tribes, Muslim
And they were
Turkic
close
tribes.
though to succeed, weren't they?
But yeah, but
It's just sheer luck, basically. That
yeah, that's
they
what saved Constantinople a generation earlier, basically. And so amazingly, I think a lot of generals, particularly generals in their teens, would have said, let's stay here, let's get the prize, then I'm the man. But he was incredibly mature and went, I don't wanna, but I'm gonna have to break the siege and I have to deal with the problem from the east because that's a real danger to my power base rather than Constantinople where everybody's just hiding behind the walls. So 10 out of 10 to Murad for doing that. But Murad was getting a bit tired and so he decided to get his son. He basically retired and allowed his very young son of sort of like round about 10 years old of Mehemed II. He goes, you, son, can be sultan, and I'm going to now kick back and relax within the harem.
He's
Probably
the
not the
first
world's.
one to try to retire, though, isn't
Yeah,
he?
yeah, and he's not that. Yeah, I mean, you get Diocletian, the Roman emperor,
I
who
mean,
decided to retire as well.
In the Ottomans, I mean, in the Ottoman
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah,
realm.
yeah. First one to do that, but I mean, every now and then in history, you get somebody going, "I can't be bothered doing this anymore.
Yeah.
I'll get someone else to do it." But almost immediately, within a year, you now get some Western Christian forces now threatening the Western side of the empire. And Murad realizes, yeah, my 10-year-old son is not up for this, up to this. I better take over again.
Because he too is too focused. He's trying to. I'm going to get Constantinople, right? I'm going to go there now. I'm 10 years maybe, but I'm going to get that bitch.
Basically, yes. So then Murad dies, and so now we get Mehmet II coming back again. This is his second time being sultan. He is still only 21 years old, and he decides.
Isn't he 19 at this point? I believe it's 19 years.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
I'm not quite sure. I'm pretty certain that he's 19 when he conquers.
Look, I hear you. You've read the book more recently than me, so feel free to correct me. But yeah, the point is, he's still very young. When we talk about these sultans who ruled in this era for like 20, 30 years, we tend to think they died as old men. But Murad II, he died in his 40s. Mehmet II, who we're just about to come on to, he dies in his 40s. So actually, although they ruled for decades, they're actually dying young and they're not being assassinated or poisoned. All we can say is they're dying from natural causes. We don't have the medical records to know what it is, but it may even be slightly hereditary if we keep getting these. There's 3 sultans in a row who all die kind of in their 40s. We don't know why. So he's very young. He decides he's going to besiege Constantinople. And what happens then in 1453 is what's known as the Great Siege of Constantinople. It's incredibly.
I want to add that we did make last year. We did make with Professor Roger Crowley.
Oh yes, what a great man. Yes,
which I highly recommend checking out.
Yeah, he's done some amazing books around this. And he's done a better job. Look, I'm really pleased when you reached out to me and wanted to talk to me about the early sultans.
Glad you did that.
Always a pleasure. But the thing is, when you read a book about the Ottomans, and it's actually like this with like the British history as well. It's like they'll admit that there were the Romans, then they just sort of fast forward, and then they'll get to 1066, the Battle of Hastings. Yeah. It's like, well, hang on, there's like 800 years in the middle of there. We're not going to do more about this. Generally, when it comes to a book about the Ottoman Empire, everything we've talked about in this podcast, the Civil War, Osman, Murad II, all these people, that's usually just one chapter. and they just try to get to 1453 as fast as possible. Now, 1450. Go on.
I must confess, the first time that I came actually into Ottoman history and found an Islamic history in the first place was the Netflix series of all things. That made a series about the conquest of Constantinople, and I thought it was so good. And I was like, this looks like fascinating to me. I have to learn more about this, and I came down the rabbit hole to the Ottoman history, and it fascinated
That's great to hear.
Fascinated me. And if anyone has seen the series, it's not entirely accurate necessarily, but I highly recommend it. It's a great introduction to the Ottoman Empire. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's great to hear. So the point I want to make is 1453 is not the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, but if you read a lot of books about it, it feels like it is. It's actually a quarter of the way through the story. So funnily enough, in my book, it's a quarter of the way through the book. I want to give each one of these sultans, and it is, you keep mentioning sort of specific sultans rather than necessarily societal changes, and I think it's absolutely valid because it's from the same family, and they were autocrats. Everything ran through the sultan. That changed right at the very end of the story. But I think that if you were trying to explain British history through the kings and queens of England/Britain, it would work for the first 400 years, but it would increasingly go more and more irrelevant. But with the Ottoman Empire, it pretty much works. Each sultan brought his own personality to the empire, which led to changes in legal systems or military targets, etc. So it's really, really important to see this. And Mehmet, so with Crowley, he's going to do a better job than me, but cutting a long story short, what's interesting is if you guys were in lockdown with COVID in 2020, in most places there was like a lockdown for 12 weeks. That is slightly longer than the siege of Constantinople. Just to put it into context, we were under siege in our houses for longer than the people of Constantinople. But the importance of 1453 cannot be understated. First of all, from the point of view of Mehmet, it sort of like seals the deal on the Ottoman Empire. There's no longer another little empire or another little power right next to him, so almost absorbed by it. It's now his capital city. That's important for him.
And this is crucial as well, that kind of this stops being, that it makes the Ottomans stop being a frontier empire and
absolutely,
actually
yes,
legitimate, for the lack of better words, legitimate empire from now on.
Yes, yeah. Now, I think we could argue that it's been a legitimate empire perhaps for about 50 years, but for everybody else, they're all paying attention to it now. Absolutely. Then for military history, this is the first battle that is decisively decided by gunpowder. So, from this point onwards, we got to pay attention to those gun things. They're getting popular.
I can picture Urban, who was the guy who had the guns that made for Mehmed, the big ones, and he just comes in and it pitches like, okay, guns, big. There you go.
How big can we make the tubes? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the biggest one was called the Basilisk, and yeah, I mean, so we're talking about massive. I mean, they were the stealth bombers of their era. They were so technologically advanced. As I pointed out, guns had existed before. His father had tried using cannons against the walls, but now the cannons had got bigger and were the mixture of the gunpowder was more efficient. And just all the artillery processes were just so basically it was the Ottoman Empire that was leaders in the world at that time. Everybody else caught up, but 1453, probably if you'd put any army in front of the Ottoman army, the Ottomans might well have won at that time. So that's 1453 in terms of military. It's in terms of the Ottomans, but also this is probably where we can draw a line under when did the Roman Empire end. I have another book called The Roman Empire in 100 Facts, and the last fact is actually more of a question. It's like, when do you finish the Roman Empire? Is it the fall of Rome? or is it the fall of Constantinople? In which case, maybe we talk about the Fourth Crusade, or is it 1450? So lots of different ways, but it's very hard to say that there's anybody considering themselves properly Roman linked to that history after 1453.
And I think there's a joke that technically the medieval era started with the fall of the Romans and it ended with the fall of the Romans.
Yeah. That's always a good one. Yeah. So so I mean that's what we've covered in this time is just 150 years, and we still haven't got. In my opinion, I think that if you ask your average person who has a bit of an understanding of history, of Ottoman history, they'll know three things. They'll know about the fall of Constantinople, 1453. They've probably heard of Suleiman the Magnificent, and most people know that they were in World War I, Gallipoli, and they finished at the end of that. That's three things out of 600 years of history. And we finished this podcast on the first one. So that shows you how rich, how much more is going on in this culture than kind of anywhere else. Is there anything you want to add at the end of part one? Is there any other questions you got to ask?
I wanted to ask, where can people buy your book if they're listening? Where can people? Do you have anything else you want to promote? Any social media where people might find you? For any links you want to put in the description?
Okay, so so for the book, it's called The Sultans. It has a subheading, but if you just type in, the great thing about my name, Jem Duducu, is it's really unusual. So you can find me on Twitter at Jem Duducu. If you want to see all the books I've written, just type Jem Duducu. That's Duducu at the end. So JEM and then Duducu.
Pretty straightforward, pretty much.
Yeah, very straightforward. You can just type that into Amazon. You'll see everything that I've written, and you'll see The Sultans there. But The Sultans is available. It's published through Amberley Books. You can get it anywhere you get books, basically. I have my own podcast called Condensed Histories. It's a very different kind of podcast where I take a piece of pop culture and show the real history behind it. So the politics behind the board game Monopoly, for example, or how much history can you get out of Star Wars? I've managed to do that. Anyway, so podcast, Twitter, check out the books, all the usual things. But I can't wait to do part two.
Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned for part two, which is coming out next week. This has been That Age 12. We are available on Instagram. You can find us under That Age 12. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. If you do have the time, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. That will help us out a lot. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.